Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 13th edition of IGDC. This year, we have around 120 plus eminent speakers sharing their invaluable experiences, insights, trends, and professional as well as personal journeys over the next 2 days. Today, in this session, it is an honor to have Apurva Joshi with us and talk about how he broke into the international game industry. Before we jump into the session, I would like to introduce Apurva. Apurva is from Pune and currently lives in Copenhagen, where he works for Unity. Before working on game engines, he has worked on video games at Playdate and on supercomputers at NVIDIA. He loves talking about computer graphics, maths, and programming. He keeps sharing his knowledge on social media platforms like Twitter and has a technical blog too. So just as information, we have 30 minutes for presentation plus 10 to 15 minutes for QA. The audience can type their questions into the Q&A tab. Only question asked in the Q&A tab would be taken up with the speakers. The feedback form link for this talk will be shared as soon as in the handout tabs. Please take a minute to fill this survey. That helps us with your feedback by end of this session. With this intro, I would like to hand it over to Apurva. Over to you, Apurva.
Hey, so I had kind of like a cool video planned and recorded, but technology as technology is goes wrong. So we can't there's some issue with basically screencasting my audio to you guys. So I'm just gonna read it out. So it's gonna be a bit it's not gonna be as polished as a video, but hopefully it'll be a bit more polished than just me blabbering at my laptop camera. So I think the talk will take around 15 minutes. And then the rest of time, I think it's just Q&A. So here it goes. And if you can't hear me for whatever reason, Rupesh, feel free to drop in and kind of just, interrupt me. So this talk is called How I Broke into the International Games Industry. So, hey, I'm Apurva Joshi. I currently live in Copenhagen and I'm from Pune. I currently work at Unity and I've also worked at some other companies that you might have heard of, like NVIDIA, and I interned at Microsoft and at Playdate. I'm a graphics engineer by profession, which means that I use math and computers to make 3D look good and run fast. When I graduated with a bachelor's degree from MIT, the one in Pune, by the way, not the one in Massachusetts, in 2014, I wanted to break into the international games industry. So I applied to a lot of jobs outside of India. Mostly no one replied. The handful of people that did reply wrote back with rejections. Meanwhile, most of my friends were flying off to the US for their master's degrees, which I could not financially afford. So even in retrospect, I was a pretty good programmer at this point. And yet I was really struggling to find a rewarding career path. Now that I do work in the international games industry, quite a lot of people from India reach out to me for advice on how to get hired internationally. 60% of the attendees of this conference are programmers and 55% are juniors or aspirants. Given these demographics, I think it makes a lot of sense for me to talk about my personal journey and some takeaways instead of talking about something technical like GPU architecture or graphics algorithms or 3D math. I'd like to split the rest of this talk into 3 parts. I tell you my story, I give you actionable things to work on, and then finally we do a Q&A session. So before we go to the story, just post in the public chat, if you can hear me fine and if all is good, because it feels a bit strange to just talk at a laptop screen for 15 minutes. So I'm gonna be keeping an eye on the public chat video. Oh, thank you. Cool. Okay, so my story. Thanks for all the answers in the Q&A. I was born in 1992 in Pune. At this point, my mom worked at the bank and my dad worked as a software engineer. So when most people in India hadn't even seen a computer, I was born into a house with a personal computer. the Intel 80486. That's in the original x86 series, in case you're wondering. We moved to Singapore when I was a couple of years old, moved back to India within a year, and then moved to the UK when I was 5. We stayed there for 2 years while my dad worked on the Y2K crisis. I even went to school in the UK, which was pretty formative for me. My dad tried teaching me COBOL when I was 7, but couldn't really make a dent. So I organically got into basic programming after we came back to India, and I was coding seriously by the time I was 9. I made an expense tracking system in Visual Basic for my mom by the time I was 11. So someone's asking, what's the Y2K crisis? And that's basically in the year 2000. People thought that like a lot of old business systems were using just two numbers to encode the date. So when the year 99 flipped to 2000, it would be just 00. And people thought that would cause all kinds of problems and planes falling from the sky and so on. But it was just some like business systems had to be recoded to have 4-digit year dates. Yeah. So I started making games using this C# framework called XNA, and I read GPU Gems books in school, most of which I didn't really understand at the time. So I mainly just looked at the pictures. I participated in this student outreach program called Microsoft Student Partners, where we hosted events and gave talks and stuff like that. I met a bunch of exceptional programmers there, and I'm still in touch with a lot of them. Through this program, and after a lot of interview rounds, I got a summer internship at Microsoft in Hyderabad, where I worked on the Bing team on search engine ingestion for a few months. And this was when I was in the 3rd year of my bachelor's degree. In the meantime, in my free time, I was making small mobile games for Android and old Nokia phones. I was also making a puzzle game called Socioball. Just before I graduated, I actually had a booth at this conference, IGDC, in 2013. I showed off Socioball there, and it got the attention of this guy called Shailesh Prabhu. Shailesh had already worked in the Indian games industry for a few years, and in 2014, he had his own company. So Shailesh and I ended up partnering up and shipping Socioball on iOS and on Android. So in 2015, at the age of 22, I had programmed for more than 10 years, shipped a proper mobile game, interned at Microsoft, and had several smaller projects in my portfolio. And even then, I got nearly 0 responses when I applied to game jobs internationally. I kept applying to jobs, and I kept speaking at IGDC, and I kept networking. So one day I got a LinkedIn message from the vice president at NVIDIA. Turns out that he was visiting their office in Pune and asked me whether I wanted to come in for a chat. So you just don't say no to that kind of offer. So I went. The chat turned into an interview where we discussed some of the stuff I had worked on and talked about some linear algebra. So after a couple more rounds, I was offered a job in the local team. So I worked at NVIDIA on GPU compute. It still wasn't exactly what I wanted to work on, but it was very adjacent. I learned a massive amount of new things at NVIDIA, and it's still the cornerstone of my career to this day. After working at NVIDIA for over 2 years, I applied and got into Playdead in Copenhagen. This was my first job outside of India. Playdead, for those of you who don't know, made the games Limbo and Inside. I moved to Copenhagen and worked on their next project. I made many graphics and tooling things for them, and it's been the most productive phase of my career in terms of the sheer volume of work produced. I got to work with some amazing engineers and artists, and I learned a lot from them. And last year, I joined Unity, where I work on graphics in the engine. So that's kind of my story so far. Now we come to part 2 of the talk, where I give you 5 actionable things to work on and tell you how they relate to me. Number 1, work hard. This is going to sound obvious and maybe a bit obnoxious, but of all the people that ask me for advice, work ethic is my number one recommendation. If you're attending this conference, you're probably from India. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's really hard to get hired internationally from India, and the game industry is no exception. We need work permits everywhere, so companies don't hire us easily internationally. You need to put in the hours to be able to make it. I think it's really important to cultivate the discipline of working hard over a long period of time. While I have had a full time job at NVIDIA working on GPU compute, at night I studied graphics. I worked on a number of open source projects and I worked on this image editor called Papaya. I even ended up writing a paper that got accepted into a prestigious graphics journal, which helped me land my next job. At Playdead, in my spare time, I studied digital signal processing, which is foundational to computer graphics. I also built some render graph stuff in the Rust programming language and read a whole lot of graphics papers. I've also kept working on Papaya, my image editor. I've added nodes. I moved it from a native application written in C to the web browser, mostly written in Rust compiled to WebAssembly. I moved it from OpenGL to WebGL. I put it up on the web. More recently, by the way, you can see the thing live on papaya.io right now if you want. More recently, I've learned about how the cloud works, running code, saving data, and authenticating users. I feel like there is so much to learn, and you just need an internet connection to be able to learn it. To sum up my point, work harder. Try and have personal projects if your life situation allows for it. If it doesn't allow for it, try to get more publicly demonstrable work out of your education and your day job. So my number two recommendation for you is zoom in and zoom out. Whenever you're working on something, be disciplined about zooming in and seeing how things work under the hood. Papaya, back when I was working on it during NVIDIA times, supported drawing brushstrokes and erasing things and undoing them. Super basic, right? I realized that I could frame the problem of drawing brushstrokes in an interesting way. And the academic literature on the subject was very limited. So I tried to write a paper, and to my surprise, it got accepted into a big graphics journal. In retrospect, unsurprisingly, my paper isn't rocket science. I just posed brushing as an integration problem. But at the time, I really learned to exercise my applied math muscles because of it. You will often have a choice between a quick fix and putting in the extra effort to understand the space more deeply. Try and choose the latter option as much as you can. As you get deeper in your technical understanding, you'll often find yourself going down technical rabbit holes. In moments like these, it's also important to be able to zoom out and understand the broader context. This is often harder than zooming in, since you need to understand a larger surface area of the problem you're tackling. A lot of the time at NVIDIA, I was fixing bugs and maintaining a large system. So I didn't really have time for, understanding the bigger context, at least at my day job. So to zoom out, I learned in my free time the basics of machine learning because AI was a major use case we were supporting. I also tried understanding why multi-GPU and heterogeneous computing was increasingly becoming a thing, and why NVIDIA was investing in networking architecture like NVLink or Mellanox. I mean, all of this was way above my pay grade, and even now, I only have a vague outline of the answers to these questions. Zooming out, though, will also help you identify stepping stones, and that's my broader point here. So, for instance, working on supercomputers at face value seems completely unrelated to gaming until you realize that both sectors use GPUs heavily. It's a lot easier to find a job within India, and there's a lot of interesting work happening in the country. You just need to know where to look. So to recap, when you're working on anything, try to remember to zoom in and to zoom out of the problem space. Number three, market yourself. So you need to have a good product, but it also needs to reach the right audience. This is also applicable to your own career. Always have a CV ready. Have at least 2 to 3 personal projects there that you can talk about in detail if you get an interview. Do you have a website? I've had a website ever since I was 17 years old. It didn't have great content from the start, but it doesn't really matter. You can start with what you know and grow from there. Are you on Twitter? There are a lot of interesting game developer communities on Twitter. Are you engaging with them? My boss at Playdead had already followed me on Twitter before I got hired, and my interviewers at Unity already knew my work before they interviewed me. And Rupesh here knew me from Twitter, which is why I got invited to give this talk. So, social networks are far from perfect, but especially as a junior, you can really use them to publicize your work and to follow industry news. So, Twitter is still largely how I keep up with advances in computer graphics. Are you going to conferences? If you're watching this, you likely are, and good on you. I've met people at IGDC that have changed my life. Remember the vice president at NVIDIA reaching out to me? Turns out that Shailesh, my business partner and friend, had recommended me to Rajesh Rao, the then CEO of Dhruva Interactive and the current convener of this conference, IGDC. And Rajesh had put in a good word for me at NVIDIA, which had gotten me the interview. So, yeah, it's really important to put yourself out there. My final 2 points. So, number 4, introspect. Ask yourself why you want to work in games. Is it because you enjoy playing games? Well, have you tried making games? Because playing games and making them is not the same thing at all. Some parts of the industry have famously long work hours and really low pay. Are you going to be okay with that? If not, how would you like to position yourself? I'm personally more interested in technology than I'm in artistic expression or game design. So I position myself as a graphics or systems engineer. What are your strengths and weaknesses? I'm bad at juggling multiple things, but I'm really good at doing focused work for a very long stretch of time. If you do get to work outside of India, are you going to be happy living away from family? In India, we really glorify emigration, but we tend to gloss over the fact that it can be quite hard on you, both culturally and personally. The more you understand yourself, the better equipped you will be to steer your career. So I'm asking you to introspect a bit more deeply than just saying, I love playing video games, so I want to work on video games. And my last piece of advice, so number 5, is be kind. We can never forget that privilege is a very real thing. So if you're watching this, you're probably somewhere in the middle of the privilege distribution. You're privileged enough to be able to watch this on a computer or mobile phone with access to the internet, but you're not privileged enough to be born in the middle of Silicon Valley to billionaire parents. I've been privileged enough to be born in a family with a personal computer, with a mom that quit her job and stayed home to raise me, and a dad who taught me computing from an early age. I've been privileged enough to have gone to school in the UK and become fluent in English from an early age, which is a game changer when facing the broader world. And I've been privileged enough to catch the lucky breaks that I did. So I think it's really important to recognize the privilege that you have and be kind to others around you. And it's also equally important to recognize that the privilege that you don't have and then be kind to yourself. And that's really it for my talk. I'm going to be in the Q&A now, but you can always also drop me an email at apurvaj@apurvaj.io. You should be able to find me easily on the internet if you have any further questions or feedback. And thank you for attending. And I would also like to thank Rupesh for inviting me. So yeah, time for the Q&A. Let me see. I can see some picked questions. There aren't that many, so let me kind of visit all of them. And feel free to post more in the chat now. The first one is, what basics do I need to learn for complete 3D from scratch? And I mean, define from scratch, right? Like you can get as low as you want in the stack, and you can like wire up your own transistors and define like draw something, or you can use like Vulkan, or you can use Unity, or anywhere in the spectrum, or you can go to Shader Toy. So what I would actually recommend is kind of hone in what you're interested in. If you're more interested in making like a game or more higher level of things to begin with, then maybe start in Unity. And this is, I'm not just recommending it because I work at Unity, but because it's kind of an easier platform to write, like C# in, and then you just write some shaders or some post processing and it works. But over time, if you want to get more interested and more involved in graphics, maybe go down to OpenGL and write something in C or Rust and OpenGL or whatever. Really, the language doesn't matter, and understand mathematics. So to go back to the question, what basics do I need to learn for complete 3D from scratch? And the answer is, it really depends. And if you take the whole problem of 3D graphics in one bite, it'll take forever to learn and it'll be extremely daunting. Instead of that, position yourself on top of a stack and then kind of slowly work your way down. So start with Unity if you have no experience, and then write some shaders. Then maybe do what Unity is doing in C or Rust or whatever. Learn some linear algebra. There are some really good YouTube videos called The Essence of Linear Algebra on YouTube by 3 Blue 1 Brown. So watch those. Just 7 videos will give you a pretty good understanding of matrix operations. I hope that answers your question. Just the essence is like make stuff. Like you cannot really learn theory like in college and expect to, survive and thrive. Just make stuff. What books or videos are good to learn 3D programming and game math? So, as I said, 3 Blue 1 Brown is a really good starting point, extremely well made. And no specific book comes to mind, but kind of just start making stuff. And if you have any specific questions for like, what's the best book to learn digital signal processing, then I might have some kind of recommendations. But I would say don't start with DSP. It's like too theoretical. So the next question by Binigya, I hope I'm not butchering your name, is, are doing personal projects the viable way to get noticed and hired by international studios? I mostly work on 2D mobile games, but I would like to work on AAA games. So I'm doing some personal projects in 3D and graphics, but I am doubtful. So it's really the only way to, I would say, either you kind of take a greater financial risk and just study for a master's if you can. I could not do that. And even if you can, just be aware that it's higher risk because there's no guarantee that you will get hired in the game industry or any industry in that country. But yeah, otherwise just make 3D projects and you will not really get noticed, but you will have to apply very aggressively, and you will probably not have, like, if you start applying to Naughty Dog, you won't get in. But apply to lesser known studios, or it's all about supply and demand. So Naughty Dog has a bunch of applications coming in, but lesser known studios might not. So just broaden your search, or do what I did, especially if you're more technically inclined, and look within the country. I know NVIDIA is doing great stuff. Intel, I think, also has operations there, and maybe AMD has as well. So just look locally as well. The next question by Rupesh is, what frameworks or engine do you use to build games as early stages or in beginning projects? So I started out with XNA because Unity, I think, was just like getting started at that point. I might be wrong, but I think so. And and I was also interested in like understanding how the lower level API worked. But otherwise, I don't really like make games anymore, really. So when I do explorations, I love Rust, and in my personal time, I want to have fun. So I just pick Rust plus something. So when I made the render graph thing, I made it in Rust, and I don't remember something on top of Vulkan, some bindings to Vulkan. But I think for you, it really depends on where you're starting. If you're an absolute beginner, I would recommend getting started on a high level on top of some engine. Can It doesn't have to be Unity. It can be, there are many engines out there, Bevy, Godot, maybe even Unreal. I think Unreal is a bit complicated, but you can go for it. Rupesh Manke asks, knowing your recent attempts at the Rust language, what would you advise to a beginner now, Rust or C++? And the answer is, if you want to get a job, C++, right? Like, you need to know C++. And I'm not talking about like modern C++. I don't know a lot of like programming language theory myself, but I mean, I work on C++ for like my day job, and I have since NVIDIA basically. So at all of my jobs after NVIDIA, I've written C++ to earn my salary. So you just need to understand a subset, which is Orthodox C++ or whatever. Don't need to understand all the C++ 20 features. But for fun, like, for sure, learn Rust. I think it's an amazing language. I think it has a great future ahead of it, and it's the language that like makes me believe in computing really again. So I really love the language. And Papaya is entirely built in Rust. So I'm also like putting my money where my mouth is. Is it better to focus on one field of programming like AI engine programming or graphics, or try to learn a little bit of everything? And I think in the beginning, I think it's nicer to be kind of like a generalist. I think even graphics has many sub areas, but just learn a bit of everything to understand what you like, and then go from there. I am working as a game developer and developing games using Unity, but I want to learn the mechanics of graphics from scratch like you. Please guide me as to how I can learn graphics and graphics math. So just don't use Unity basically. Write your own thing. You won't be able to make something as impressive as you would in Unity, but that's fine. Like, I think if you apply to jobs, technical people appreciate low level work. Like, no one really cares how good your game is to play. But even if you render, like, I don't know, like some mesh in 3D or something in Vulkan, people will understand, okay, wow, like he or she probably understands how how the Vulkan swap chain works and all of the memory management and stuff like that. So it's okay. Just make something lower level than Unity. Any tips for entering as an AI programmer? I don't know. I'm not a good person to ask, strangely enough, but I would say a lot of the similar tips would apply. Is search for something locally if you can, something interesting that might be easier to get into, and just study more in detail, like zoom in and zoom out, and hopefully that should be able to help. What does a graphic designer do? Does he make game objects or engine? I think you can read this up online, but a graphic designer is not a graphics programmer. They're very different things. But can we have your email? So my website is apurvaj.io. So how my name is spelled, then a J for Joshi, my last name, and then .io. And my email is on there. In what way can limited animation and interaction? I don't think I'm a good person to answer that question, Sahil. Because I've never really pitched an idea. Like, I work more on the engine side of things rather than the creative side of the game. Thank you, Rishi. Rishi says that he's a fan of me and like happy to see me doing well. Thank you. G. Prasanna asks, hi, I'm an ECE student. I did not study DSP. where do we make use of DSP correctly? So, okay, that's a good question, and I could talk for hours, but I'll try to be short. DSP is at the foundation of computer graphics, really. Like everything we do is digital signal processing. So every image you see on screen really consists of a bunch of, well, it's displayed on pixels, right? But an image in real life is a continuous signal. So like it varies. Even if you zoom in infinitely on a real world image, it just keeps on going on, right? Like there is no discontinuities. Like telescopes don't see aliasing when they'll zoom into space. So the real problem is when you display things on a discrete grid like a pixel screen, you are doing strange things to the signal. You're quantizing the signal and you're sampling it at like periodic frequencies. And you run into all kinds of issues when that happens. So on my website, I've written a blog post about aliasing in video games and where that comes from. And I think you can get a good grasp of why DSP is important if you read that. But the quick answer is like almost all of graphics and photography depends on like is basically analyzing 2D signals and working with 2D signals. Silas, are there any trends or potentials that you see internationally of overlapping skills required for specialized roles? I think yes. I would say that actually game design is very hard to get into, is my loose observation. But programming especially is a lot easier because people like it's kind of narrow at the top, and it's always hard to find people who are, let's say, skilled in graphics or any specialization. Even if you're like the best physics engineer, you'll probably be able to get hired internationally. Probably not right out of college or university, but yeah, pretty soon in your career, I think. Rupesh asks, we still have 12 minutes, so I'm trying to answer every question that I can. Would you want a fresher to start learning Vulkan directly, or should he focus on OpenGL or D3D 10 or 11 to begin with, and then move to modern graphics APIs? That's a good question, and I would actually recommend learn OpenGL first. I don't think every single person would recommend that, but I kind of feel strongly about it because Vulkan is absolutely nuts. Like it's almost as if the graphics engineers have said, okay, you implement the driver yourself, and like good luck. So I'm not the biggest fan of Vulkan from a usability perspective. I've heard really good things about Metal, like Apple's Metal API, but I've never really used it. So if you have access to a MacBook easily, maybe learn Metal, but otherwise OpenGL is the way to go, especially if you just want to learn about how the graphics pipeline works. I would say write something in OpenGL and learn RenderDoc, which is the tool that you use to inspect the pipeline. And just using those two things, right, like OpenGL and RenderDoc, I think you will grow massively as a graphics engineer. So yeah, start with OpenGL, I would say. For a person who aspires to be a game developer, which programming languages would you suggest them to learn as a beginner? Which languages can help a fresher be hired in any company, either Indian or international? I would say if you want to start in Unity, learn a bit of C#, and then like light C++ or C. Like it's like the boundary C with a little bit of C++ features. But yeah, those are mainly the two things. But like I think programming language skill is really transferable. So it doesn't really matter. I think you just pick one and start. Like make stuff is like my number one recommendation. Don't get stuck in like deciding. Yeah, but I think C++ is kind of a necessity if you want to get into systems programming. Would you be able? Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you, Abhay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So there is one more question, Apurva. You wanna
Yeah.
take it?
Cool. So the question is visual scripting going to take the place of game programmers? And I think I'm not fully convinced. Like, if you look at even shader graphs, there are many things you cannot do with visual scripting. They become very like loopy and just not very nice. But I think there's going to be some interesting progress in the area. So I would suggest you look at this one thing. I might be mistyping it, but I'm going to type it into chat. It's called Beyond Systems. There are these folks. I think one of them kind of works at RAD, which is acquired by Unreal at the moment. But anyway, they're working on this like expressing programming languages into an abstract syntax tree and then visualizing that. So I think there's going to be more interesting research going forward, but not entirely. Based on my experience working on a game production team, I think there are people always between the spectrum of full scripting to full engine programming. There's like lots of glue that's required. So not immediately, but if you're like a PL person, there's interesting research. And I think Unreal is also working on, like, Tim Sweeney has dropped hints on Twitter that they've recently hired the guy behind Haskell, the Lisp implementation, and they're making a programming language for the next Unreal Engine called Verse or something. And yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, and I have a feeling that they will have a visual scripting interface to that language. So maybe, but not entirely. Like, learn, always go deeper into the stack. I think that's all the questions.
Yeah. I would like to thank Apurva for a very insightful session. We highly appreciate for taking time and being with us, helping our Indian gaming fraternity with your guidance and advice. Going by all the chats, people have already loved your patience and insight with all the questions. Thank you once again, Apurva. I will meet you at the backstage. So, guys, the next session on the tech track is by Rajiv Sharma on using Unreal Engine for VFX pipeline. Stay tuned.